Okay, now we're going to be turning our attention to the wisdom literature and talk about how to, with regards to hermeneutics and exegesis. So we're going to talk about Proverbs, Job, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. Now, as we'll see, there's some literature that's easy to interpret, like Proverbs 11:13. A gossip betrays a confidence, but a trustworthy person keeps a secret. Hatred stirs up conflict, but love covers all sins, over all wrongs. So numerous passages in wisdom literature raise questions, for example, Proverbs 22, verse 4. Humility is the fear of the Lord. Its wages are riches and honor and life. So does this teach always that if a Christian is poor, they either must not be humble or they don't fear God? Does it teach rich Christians are more humble and God-fearing than poor Christians? Okay, that's something that needs to be discussed, and we're going to talk about how to correctly interpret Proverbs. Ecclesiastes 10:19, a feast is made for laughter, wine makes life merry, and money is the answer for everything. Is the author recommending partying, drinking, and the pursuit of money? So we've got to put that in context, as we'll see. So the narratives, law, and prophets stress the importance of believe and obey, right? The wisdom books are going to tell us to think. They're going to stress and think about things. All right. Listen, look, think, reflect, meditate. So it helps us to develop our character. Wisdom literature makes a subtle but unmistakable suggestion that godly living involves making solid, common sense choices. So it's very, very practical. And I'm actually going through some lessons right now on the book of Proverbs. It's really helping out. It's a combination of knowledge, but not just your head, but also with you got to let that course go down to your heart and let it be brought out into your life. And so that's something we need to think about is how we live in the real world in a right and godly manner. Now, while each book is different in its role, we must look beyond the differences and see how they integrate. And I thought this was really interesting. I never kind of thought about this before. I'm glad that they point out something. So Proverbs is the basic approach to life and how you should make wise choices. But there are exceptions. So the book of Job is exception number 1, the suffering of the righteous. Exception number 2, Ecclesiastes, the failure of the rational, ordered approach to provide ultimate meaning to life. And there's Song of Solomon or Song of Songs, exception number 3, the irrationality of romantic love between a husband and wife. So let's look at these. So Proverbs provides a rational, ordered norms of life. They're not universal truths, but they're norms for life. They're general truths. God has set in place an orderly, rational world, and it all makes sense. And for example, if you work hard, if you're not lazy, you will prosper. But if you don't, you'll be poor. And it talks about don't be like the lazy man. Wise, hardworking people can expect a blessed, prosperous life, while foolish, slothful, lazy people can expect a hard life. That's normative, but it doesn't cover every person's situation in life. You think about Proverbs 22, verse 6. Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he's old, he will not depart from it. There may be parents who have tried their best to train up their child to do what's right, and sadly, they don't live faithfully. There's some who didn't train up their child, and maybe that child turns out and comes around and repents and changes his life and converts to Christ. That's something to think about. Okay, so these are general truths. This is something that generally might happen, is supposed to happen. It's kind of like whatever a man sows, that will he also reap. Okay, so let's look at the book of Job. Job teaches us there are events in life beyond our control that shatters the norms set forth in Proverbs. Sometimes tragedy besets the wise, the righteous, and hardworking with no explanation as to why. Proverbs teaches us that life is rational and can be understood. But Job, he qualifies this with real life experience, real world experience, right? So taken together, we can see that most of life is rational, can be understood, but there's some events that may take place that are inexplicable, and we just can't understand it all. Our wisdom approach from Proverbs fails us in these times, and we must rely on our faith in the Creator, which is what Job did. Ecclesiastes, exception number 2. Okay, so Ecclesiastes is an intellectual search for life, meaning in life, and Solomon is the one who's doing this. And Solomon concludes that wisdom alone does not provide the meaning of life. In fact, for the first 11 chapters, so to speak, well, really 12, except for the conclusion of the matter, he provides a cynical, very negative approach, pessimistic analysis he gives to the thesis of an ordered, rational universe. And the ultimate conclusion is found in the last verse, which is the way to find true meaning in life is to fear God, keep His commandments, for this is man's all. That it lies in our relationship with God. So logic and rational thought can help us in our day-to-day life, but ultimate meaning in life requires relationship with God. Song of Solomon, exception number 3. Okay, so we got Proverbs that provides good advice on marriage. It shows us how we ought to behave in our marriages. However, it's difficult to build a great love relationship on rational thought alone. And believe me, I can attest to this. Song of Solomon celebrates the wild, irrational, mushy, and corny aspects of true love. So the book suggests that in the marketplace, husbands and wives need to be quiet, discerning, hardworking people of Proverbs, but if once they're alone in the privacy of their own home, they need to be crazy, madly in love, slight, irrational couple that's found in the Song of Solomon. That's the G version of saying these things. Now, we have to recognize that God created sexual desires in us. He created us with these, but of course, He gave us the fulfillment, the outlet where these are lawful, and that is in marriage covenant, in the marriage covenant. Okay. Wisdom is poetry, so a large majority of wisdom literature is poetry with short narrative sequences in Job and a moderate amount of prose in Ecclesiastes. And we see that, once again, parallelism is used, like synonymous parallelism is about Job's complaint. Oh, that my vexation were weighed and all my calamity were laid in the balances. We see God's response to Job. Have you entered into the springs of the sea or walked in the recesses of the deep? And what about Ecclesiastes, where it says, for in much wisdom is much vexation, and he who increases knowledge increases sorrow. Or Song of Solomon 1:10, your cheeks, talking about there's the description of the spouse. Your cheeks are lovely with ornaments, your neck with strings of jewels. Another characteristic feature is the frequent use of figurative imagery, which we saw already as well. So when we talk about Proverbs, it's on thinking, not on feeling usually, and the use of figurative imagery would be Song of Solomon, though. Okay, so Proverbs doesn't all that much sometimes use figurative. Sometimes it uses figurative imagery. Song of Solomon is definitely full of figurative imagery. Tries to, given the description of your spouse and these vivid pictures, cultural pictures of their day. It's pretty interesting. Job is also filled with a lot of symbolism designed to connect on an emotional level. Ecclesiastes lies between Proverbs and Job in its use of imagery, more than Proverbs, but less than Job. Now, on a scale that measures the use of figurative imagery, we probably put them in order of least to most: Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Job, Song of Solomon. Proverbs is perhaps the easiest of the wisdom books to understand because it speaks to everyday aspects of life, work, friendship, marriage, how to use money, how to use your tongue, how not to use your tongue. The practical nature of Proverbs makes them applicable to almost everyone. The wisdom books subordinate all their wisdom to faith in God. The most important thing to remember is interpreting Proverbs is the individual Proverbs reflect general nuggets of wisdom that are normally true, but they're not universal truths. So I really, we think about probably Solomon was teaching his son Rehoboam. So that's why it says, hear my son, your father's instruction, and forsake not your mother's teaching. And unfortunately, Rehoboam, as we see, did not live up to the right. He did not live up to. He did not listen because he listened to those young men, and his kingdom got split. Right. So, what did the text mean to the biblical audience? Let's talk about how we can use Proverbs. So, it deals with the norms of life. Proverbs 1 through 9 kind of deal with this introduction phase, you could say. And it's directly primary to young people, but this will affect how we view the entire book. Okay, Proverbs 25:24. Um, Proverbs 25:24. Let's look at that for a moment. It is better to dwell in a corner of a housetop than in a house shared with a contentious woman. I knew that's what the verse was, but I want to make sure. So it's not directed to men who have quarrelsome wives, but it's directed to young men and gives wisdom about what kind of women to avoid in marriage. Okay, so you want to think about what is it that you want to see a lady and a man who are being formed by the scriptures. That's what the kind of people we want to be like. All right, so Proverbs 1 through 9 is made up of these longer poetic units, but Proverbs 5 is a complete unit. It should be taken together, and it's really a really good chapter on staying away from adultery. Proverbs 10 through 29 contains the literary form we usually associate with a proverb. Proverbs 30 through 31 has these longer units of text, and I like how Proverbs 31 closes out with the wife, the virtuous woman, and how she fulfills lady wisdom that's found in Proverbs 9. What are the differences between the biblical audience and us? Well, each proverb usually presents a generalized principle to start with, addresses some practical aspect of everyday life. So while that's very minimal, the differences, there might be some differences in regards to culture, and you'll see those as you proceed throughout the book. What's the theological principle? Well, usually the proverb is already worded as a general principle, which is great. So, but we gotta remember not to interpret them as constant universal promises. We must keep in mind the exceptions, as we saw in the Ecclesiastes, Job, and Song of Solomon. The Proverbs provides principles to develop character, help with our choices in life. They're normally true, but not necessarily so. So how does the theological principle fit with the rest of the Bible? Does the New Testament teaching modify or qualify the principle? Well, it's actually interesting how the themes in Proverbs are also found in the New Testament. And the theme of wealth does undergo some change in the New Testament. The New Testament echoes the admonitions in Proverbs to the wealthy to support the poor. In the Old Testament in general, and Proverbs in particular, material wealth is presented as a blessing from God, as a reward for righteous living. In the New Testament, the wealth blessing becomes a spiritual blessing, one that is enjoyed in the world to come for the righteous. Store up for yourselves treasures in heaven. The New Testament actually warns Christians that remain faithful to Christ may result in a loss of material wealth. We cannot take the notion from Proverbs that faithfulness to God will result in material wealth and apply that principle. It teaches a health and wealth theology. That's a false gospel, friends. Step 5, how should individual Christians live out this modified theological principle? Well, one of the goals of wisdom is to develop character. So we develop character by doing what the book of Proverbs says to do. But we need to catch the bigger picture of being what the text tells us to be. As our character changes, so will our behavior. A soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. New Testament confirms that we are to be gentle, or to be meek in controlling our speech. Ephesians 4:2, James 1:19 through 26. Let every man be slow to speak, slow to anger, slow to wrath, or the wrath of man does not produce the righteousness of God. So for application, we should examine our own speech and our reaction to heated situations. Grasping the text means that we must make a conscious decision to change our character for the better. All right, grasping the wisdom books, we're talking about the book of Job. Job helps us grapple with this question: how do we make sense out of what just happened? And grasping meaning Job is difficult. I've studied it in school, and it was difficult in some sense. We see that Job is afflicted in chapters 1 and 2. Job and his friends search unsuccessfully for a rational answer, right? From chapter 2 to 37, and we see those speeches between him and his three friends. And then Elihu comes along and gives a principle we might find in Proverbs. But Job knows he has committed no sin to justify the calamity that has befallen him and demands to have an opportunity to present himself before God. God answers Job's accusations. Job's friends are rebuked and Job is restored. So what do the texts mean to the biblical audience? Well, we got to remember that the central lessons of the book are not evident until the last two sections, where God himself announces the lessons of the book. Several lessons are learned by the ramblings of Job's misguided friends, and we got to remember they're not inspired of God, even though they're contained in an inspired book. So they try to analyze the situation through misapplication of traditional wisdom. They assume that through wisdom they have access to all the information that they need to analyze the problem. They assume through wisdom, based on the information they have, they can correctly understand the problem, and both assumptions were wrong. Now, much of what the friends say is true in the abstract, but they say it at the wrong time and apply it to the wrong situation. And there may be a lesson to be learned by the gentle chastening of Job by God in response to his wondering, questioning, and challenging. Maybe we should be less judgmental of those who question or challenge. What are the differences between us and them? Well, it's true that we're under different covenants. Job, he was under the patriarchal law. We still want a simple and rational explanation for all the terrible things that happen. In our quest for answers, we often do as Job's friends do. We misapply the theology of Proverbs to find a cause and effect. We differ from Job in that we cannot assume all of our tragedies due to satanic involvement. We do not know any more about the cause of our troubles any more than Job did. I mean, even we knew what was going on in regards to Job. But Job didn't know. What's the theological principle in the text? Well, from Job, we can arrive at several theological principles. God is sovereign, and we're not. God knows all, and we know little. God's always just, but he does not disclose his explanation to us, and neither does he have to. God expects us to trust in his character and his sovereignty when unexpected tragedy occurs in our lives. How does this theological principle fit in with the rest of the Bible? Well, unlike the Old Testament, the New Testament presents suffering as a normal feature of the godly life, not an aberration. All those who suffer godly in Christ Jesus will suffer persecution. Matthew 10:22 through 28. So James, he actually cites Job as an example of patient suffering. How should individual Christians live out their lives in regards to this theological principle? Well, we must be careful that we do not repeat the mistakes of Job's friends and misuse biblical truth, maybe adding to a friend's grief rather than comforting. I mean, with friends like that, who needs enemies? Romans 8:28 works well with the theology of Job, but it would be quite inappropriate to refer to that biblical truth when consoling a distraught family who has just lost their 4-year-old child. I think sometimes we actually misuse Romans 8:28, to be honest. As at a moment like this, the family needs consolation. In time, they will seek the solace found in God's word, but in the midst of their pain, our role is to suffer and weep with them. Rejoice with those who rejoice, and weep with those who weep. Job tells us it's not wrong to cry out in anger and frustration. It tells us that there's probably no answer in human understanding to the why question. Our focus must be brought from the why to just focus on God and his character. Okay. Now, what about Ecclesiastes? Okay, so it's less straightforward than the other wisdom books, and it's similar to Job in that literary context must be analyzed according to the entire book, okay, not just analyzing its smaller parts. It must be interpreted as a whole, otherwise you'll just see him as a pessimistic person, okay? The book is filled with satire, is filled with sarcasm. It's autobiographical in nature, which I think is Solomon, and he is using the tools of wisdom. He attempts to analyze life itself and grasp the meaning of his existence, and he explores the nature and limitations of wisdom, and he concludes that all is unimportant in comparison with the main thing: fear God and keep his commandments, for this is man's all. So what do the texts mean to the biblical audience? Well, 3 main conclusions emerge. Apart from God, life is meaningless. Wisdom is not bad, but it does not provide the meaning of life. Wisdom does not explain the contradictions of life, it only points them out. Therefore, people should simply trust God, as we see in the book of Job. Life, therefore, is not a puzzle to be completely understood, but as a gift to be enjoyed, like we see in the Song of Solomon. We're to enjoy marriage. Most of the reflections the teacher shares, the observation he makes, or the experiences he discusses points to one of these three conclusions. What are the differences between the biblical audience and us? Well, modern man still seeks to understand the meaning of life using intellectual means. Humankind still seeks to find meaning through wealth, entertainment, philosophy, work, etc. The one significant difference is found in the teacher's limited understanding of death, with almost no reference to the afterlife, because we learn more about that from the New Testament. The teacher is concerned about meaning in relation to this life only. And to Christians, life is to be lived with the constant assurance of the future, right? Of resurrection. And then remember that, of course, he was under a different covenant. He was under the old covenant. Because human nature is still the same, the theological principles that can still be developed are similar to those already listed. Three main conclusions from the teacher's search. So remember, apart from God, life is meaningless. Wisdom is not bad, but it does not provide the meaning of life. Wisdom does not explain the contradictions of life. It only points them out. Therefore, people should simply trust God. Life, therefore, is not a puzzle to be completely understood, but a gift to be enjoyed. So how does this qualify with the rest of the New Testament, or with the rest of the Bible? So the New Testament teaches that relationship with God under the New Covenant, must be centered on the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. Therefore, all life outside of Jesus Christ is just meaningless. It's futile. Apart from Jesus Christ, life is meaningless. Right? Atheism, agnosticism, and the other religions of this world they can't make sense. Only the Christian worldview truly makes sense of all these things. The cynicism, the New Testament provides a clear picture of a glorious, victorious afterlife, in contrast to what the search of the teacher. We see the cynicism of the teacher has no place in the teachings of the gospel message, because we understand that we should have hope and assurance of what Jesus has done for us and how someday he's going to come, return, and we're going to experience the great and everlasting victory that's found through Jesus Christ our Lord, ultimate victory, because he's going to defeat death, physical death, and we're all going to, rise from the graves, and we're going to be with him throughout eternity. James drew much of his thought from the Old Testament wisdom books, including Ecclesiastes, as he blasts those misguided people who acquired wealth as a means of guaranteeing their future. Okay, so in step number 5, how should we live out these modified theological principles? Well, apart from a relationship with Jesus Christ, life is meaningless. So that it actually helps me to remain faithful as a Christian. When we think about, searching for meaning in life with regards to work or education or so forth, that's a chasing after the wind ultimately. As believers, we would do well to focus our lives on our relationship with Jesus, and in our search for the meaning of life is, of course, ultimately found in Jesus Christ. All right, Song of Solomon may be the most shocking of the books of the entire Bible because it speaks openly and joyfully of human sexuality. But we see it's, in essence, a collection of love poems between a young man and a young woman. It's organized into the courtship, the wedding, and the following life of love. It's highly emotional, full of figurative language used by the man and woman to describe their mates and express the passionate love they have for one another. So how are we to understand this book theologically? Because, Jews, they thought, hey, we got to think of this as God and Old Covenant Israel. And then some people in the church thought, hey, it's talking about Jesus in the church. Okay, so they explain it as allegories, right? So because of this, they abandoned literary context and literal meanings and spiritualized practically all Old Testament passages. And, the allegorical method it fails to hold up to close scrutiny. So we need to understand that sexuality in marriage is a big part of the relationship between a man and his wife. So if we look to wisdom literature to address the big issues of life, we should not be shocked to find a discussion about marital intimacy. All right, so what did the text mean to the biblical audience? Well, ancient Israel perceived the wonders of human sexuality fulfilled in marital love to be a divine blessing. And I think it's really interesting what this Ken Law makes. He says, the Bible does not see marriage as an inferior state, a concession to human weakness, nor does it see the normal physical love within that relationship as necessarily impure. Marriage was instituted before the fall by God with the command that the first couple become one flesh, Genesis 2:24. Therefore, physical love within that conjugal union is good. It's God's will and should be a delight to both partners. The prospect of children is not necessary to justify sexual love in marriage. Significantly, the Song of Solomon makes no reference to procreation. It must be remembered that the book was written in a world where high premium was placed on offspring and a woman's worth was often measured in terms of the number of her children. Sex was often seen with reference to procreation, yet there's not a trace of that here. The song is sung in praise of love for love's sake and for love's sake alone. This relationship needs no justification beyond itself. So if we see what this book is teaching us, it teaches us how a husband and wife were to feel toward one another and how they should express their feelings. What are the differences between the biblical audience and us? Well, yes, there's probably different cultural differences, so to speak. The joy and rationality of a couple madly in love changes little from age to age and from culture to culture. However, like they say here, compliments the opposite sex are extremely culturally specific. Would I want to call my wife and say your hair is likened to a flock of goats descending from Mount Gilead? Probably not. Or her nose resembling the Tower of Lebanon looking toward Damascus? Probably not wise. Okay. So we got to think about some culturally appropriate imagery for today. Okay. What's the theological principle in this text? Well, because human nature is still the same, the theological principles that can be developed are based on the similarities between their situation and ours. Communication, very, very important. Compliments, very, very important. Okay, so the person seeking to live a wise, godly life should be madly in love with her husband or his wife, and should express this love in strong emotional terms. How does the theological principle fit with the rest of the Bible? Well, it's interesting that, Ephesians 5 does focus on husband loves their wives as Christ loved the church. But the mystery ultimately was pointing to Christ and the church. Okay. So I think that's very interesting. Never mind. I won't go there. Step 5. So how should individual Christians live out this modified theological principle? Well, like other wisdom books, application of Song of Solomon will vary depending on the situation of the individual. However, note that the celebration of sexuality is directed to married couples or those approaching marriage. So newly married couples should read Song of Solomon, and Emily and I have done that to each other. There's a little application that can be found for those who are not married. Balancing the wisdom of Proverbs with the wisdom of Song of Solomon. It tells us that the wise person had better shift gears when he or she gets home. So we need to, how do we want to be treated, right? Apply the golden rule, right, to your situation. Do unto others like they would have them do unto you. So I hope this has been very helpful to each and every one of you. In looking at how we can interpret these different genres that's found in the Old Testament. I hope that this has been very helpful exercise in helping us to think through these things. And I hope you learned a lot, and I really appreciate you guys so much. Thank you very much.